week is a long time in politics, and we haven't actually reached a full week. And my goodness, something happened last week, which has caused, let's say, shockwaves, catastrophe, various other words we could use. When we sort of cooked up the idea of doing something very much about a post-match analysis, i.e. it was a game of 5 ways. We just had the Gordon-Denton by-election, which threw up, again, another shockwave. Without going into too much details about the past over the last sort of mid-term point and where we got to here, it was always felt by myself and colleagues at the Devo agency that the post-match analysis would be a safe thing to talk about today, because there were going to be certainly winners and losers. Obviously what we talk about a lot is devolution and devolution in the north, and what that means. And what I'm really wanting us to do today is really to get into the thick of it, think about why things don't cut through, why we need to engage more with, why are people turned off or turned on to politics these days? Why has this sort of populism sort of happened, or we're in the midst of happening of that scenario? So we have on our panel, and we've got 2 people apart from my good self on the panel, and we have Mark Logan behind us, who unfortunately had a hospital appointment because the waiting lists are going down so quickly now that it's hopped in. We hope that the technology will hold up, and we can all hear. But this is about participation. There are lots of people who are tuned in down the line and who can't participate, so you're very lucky to be here in the wonderful KPMG offices in St. Peter's Square, where we can just about see Andy Burnham round the corner. So there we are. All right, so yes, May 26th local elections will go down in history, one way or another. The end of 2-party politics was on the cards. 5-way politics, as we get, is happening. Places like Wigan, St Helens, Sunderland, Hartlepool, Gateshead, Bradford saw huge losses, and unprecedented losses, one might say. Loss of overall, nearly 1,500 Labour councillors, great council leaders such as Susan Hinchcliffe and Tom Hunt over there in Yorkshire, South Yorkshire and West Yorkshire. So it's really interesting when you actually look at what happened and what didn't happen, where the vote for UK reform, I keep calling UK reformers because I'm so old I remember UKIP, so it's like Reform UK, why was it happen? Why did that happen? Was there a correlation between Brexit voting and what's happening here? Or is it just really that Keir Starmer was really unpopular, is really unpopular? Or is it about trust, confidence in our democratic processes? I think probably the answer to all of those things is yes, it's all of those things. There's lots of things happening in the water. In the place of democracy, we're not clearly reaching out. People aren't actually understanding what's happening here in Greater Manchester and across the north with regard to the power and the empowerment that we can expect moving forward, where we're meant to be connecting more with our local communities about their priorities, what they need, so they don't feel left behind, or they don't feel that politicians are all the same. But clearly what people vote for or think the plates are shifting around number 10 as we speak. So the reason I go on about what people are voting for, because the point of devolution and empowerment and giving people some sense of control about what they're doing is that voice. And just as we look, as I've been in here, you know, you see the what you call it, crane count across the skyline. Things are happening, and the feeling of growth is being felt often in city centres, but not necessarily all parts of Greater Manchester or devolved areas, and not necessarily right across the north in all parts, because not everybody's got devolution. But where in Liverpool City region, I think, and Greater Manchester, but not in West Yorkshire, where again, and there might be different factors at play there. There is evidence that devolution is giving you empowerment, but then again, the connection between what happened in Gorton and Denton and the fact they've got a high-profile celebrity mayor didn't actually follow through. So you've got this wedge in politics today, where the centre, people look left and right, and they can't find what they're looking for in the middle. So that lack of trust in the middle is actually another key part of it. So I'm sure we can chew over what happened last week, and people will, for many decades to come, because it's not over and done with yet. But what strikes me, and has been striking me for literally probably not long after the general election, is how that massive majority turned cold so quickly and has actually just carried on going colder and colder. That is not to say that the Labour government hasn't done brilliant things, including the English Devolution and Community Empowerment Bill. But what we're not doing is we've not got the engagement. People are not connecting with that. They're not connecting with the centre. They might connect and understand Andy Burnham a bit, but they don't necessarily match that with their own personal or national politics, where the cost of living is actually not seen, it's not reaching all parts, it's not a highly good strategy. So there's lots of things that have been good, but the story has not been a good one. We've not been very good at telling the story, we've made mistakes. I say we, I'm showing my colours, and we're completely impartial here, but that point about, political instincts being, populism, globalisation, Trumpism, fears over migration, small votes, the war, climate change, cost of living, those are all factors in the reason why so many people voted in those elections, in my view, you can disagree with me, against Keir Starmer, rather than for improved public services. What is clear, the biggest loser, given the big question we're asking, who are the winners and losers, on the 7th of May was Keir Starmer. How badly that will turn out, we'll go further and deeper, I think, on that question. But what we're here today to do, and to really get some expert opinion from my fantastic online and in-person panel, is where do we go from here and what happens next? That's at the centre and the heart of what we all want to know. Now, I'm not Nosferatu, so I don't really know. We all might have a punt on what needs to be done. Is a leader change what we need, or is it more fundamental than that? The whole question around bi-party politics and how that plays out in local government and public services is quite frightening. We've lost, as I say, a lot of real expertise, and it's going to be difficult, I think, particularly in places like West Yorkshire, where the control and the leadership is with inexperienced members of council, which is not necessarily the worst thing in the world. But how are you going to get that coalition and control and collaboration working? Is where we need to do. So how it can work, but I don't think we've seen the like of this in such a sort of devastating way ever. So we live in interesting times. But the power of the North. The other big question is devolution is good, it's working, but what will this mean moving forward to the powers of devolution? Will that be slowed? And how will it work? Because I think if decision making becomes quite complicated when nobody can agree or there is no consensus, and one of the main benefits of devolution is you do get people around the table and you look at what's needed and what the priorities are locally, and generally people get behind them. But I don't think it's as easy as that moving forward, and I think you'll see therefore another word that's thrown around a lot, fragmentation. So I think that's a bit scary what I'm sort of playing out, and I think there's room for a lot of comment in the future and how and if we can get on track. I'm going to stop there because I want to introduce Myrtha Boot, who is from the IPPR North. I know her from, we worked on the net zero ABPG, Oxford, changing the world sort of thing. So I'm very pleased that she's popped up in Manchester and is actually now living here, so that's rather good. So she's very, very clever. And of course, we might not veer into climate change, but it's another thing around priorities and policies and jobs and growth moving forward, and things being delayed because of the lack of leadership, probably, or commitment to it, or antagonism to certain policies. And of course, we've got JP Spencer, who's got a new name, a new baby as well, by the way. He's got a new name called Think Labour. You can tell people what it might be called before. It's called Labour Together. We've just changed it around a little bit. But also, he's also a prolific writer, an author and thinker, and does a lot around devolution and sort of you are basically at the voice of devolution within the Labour Party. So it's really great you're here. And we have also online, and hopefully behind me, I can't see you, so is we've got Mark Logan, who was actually a Conservative MP in Bolton East, and before the general election, he obviously was fed up with his party one way or another, and actually we spent some time knocking on doors in various constituencies, and switched to his allegiance to the Labour Party. Obviously, that was the Conservatives didn't win in that constituency, and Labour did. But it's a long time coming, and we've had a bit of a journey over the last 2 years. Frustrations, caution, all of those things that I've rambled on about. But I think let's get into the thick of it in terms of what we really want to talk about. I've thrown a few curveballs there. Remember, that's you've got to pick up any footballing analogies, because I'm pretending to be Gary Lineker on Match of the Day and not doing very well so far. So I'm turning to who wants to go first. I think. I mean, what we'll do is I'm going to go to Myrtha first to give you your post-match analysis on what happened and why.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great, thank you so much. It's great to be here. It's my first panel as director of IPR, interim director. Yeah, so I think what this was an incumbent punishing election, and it was a 5-party election. So I think that's the way I'm seeing the frame of this. So I think the winners and losers can be categorized within those as well. So we have, obviously, the winners are those who are now part of that 5-party system. So we have progressives, we have Greens, but obviously Reform as the biggest winner in the North. And I think that those figures are pretty stark, and especially for those working in progressive politics, I think it's worth looking at the actual numbers and the route out that happened. If you take, for example, Sunderland, I think it's 58 Reform councillors, 5 Labour councillors. Wakefield, complete wipeout of Labour, 58 Labour, 58 Reform, 1 Labour seat. So I think we're looking at a completely different local election picture. I think it's what we predicted, but seeing that black and white is quite stark. I think that's very important to keep in mind. When it comes to the losers, so yes, I think it's the incumbent, and not just that. I think it's also a vision for change in a way that I feel like died a bit with this. So obviously Labour was elected on a promise for change, and this feels like, to me, a kind of nail in the coffin of people not believing that change has come or is forthcoming enough to give their vote, and instead to vote for other parties. Yeah, I think there's a bigger loser story as well around the topics and things like that. So that, like, is this good or bad for devolution? I would say that the devolution agenda is at risk, both through fragmentation, the spotlight now being on, leadership challenges and things like that, and personnel changes. But there are a few green shoots too. So we did see a lot of progressive parties going to progressive parties, but they were split between different parties. So I think there is a strong call for electoral reform and progressive collaboration. So I'll leave it there as an opener to the discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, I think we want to touch on, really, is there a better way? Is there a better way than, is this time for electoral reform? How do you rebuild faith in democracy? People have lost trust in the centre, and I think the point you made around, in a way, what's happened, the local elections have actually reinforced, I think, a feeling of national politics and not the benefits of devolved politics, which, in a way, is odd. Which goes back to my point, what are people voting for or against? So thank you, Berta, very good. And now JP.
Thanks. Hi everyone. So yeah, my name's JP Spencer. I'm the Director of Devolution Policy at Think Labour, which is the first time I've said that. So Think Labour is a new organisation that's kind of come out of Labour Together, which has been, you'll have seen in the news, and I won't go into all of that, but we're an organisation we've got new leadership, kind of new ways of working. We're going to be a lot more out in the open, doing things like this, which we have done in the past, but that's our modus operandi going forwards. I'm going to talk a bit about what these results mean for Northern mayors. So I published, Jill mentioned, and I write roughly every week, though not when I was on maternity leave, on Substack about things going on in the north of England. And this morning I did some analysis of the results, particularly within the established mayoral strategic authority areas. So we've got 5 in the north: Greater Manchester, Liverpool City region, the North East, South and West Yorkshire. And those 5 areas all had significant elections going on last week. And I think completely underanalyzed in any of this is, everyone talks about who's up, who's down in Westminster, it's going on right now. But the combined authorities, which are the things that the mayors work with when they're elected, those are composed of the councils within those areas. So Greater Manchester Combined Authority, which is just around the corner from here, is the 10 councils of Greater Manchester working with the mayor, Andy Burnham. And together they have to make policy change. Andy Burnham has to pass policies through that combined authority if he wants to get anything done. And if you look at the results within the 5 areas, you can see that there's been a bit of a shift, particularly in 2 areas. So within West Yorkshire and the North East, we've moved from majority Labour control to more Reform controlled councils. So in West Yorkshire, you've got at least 2 Reform majority councils, maybe another 2 Reform controlled. That means that 4 out of the 5 will be Reform. So that's going to be very different for ways of working for Tracy Braben. You've got a similar picture in the North East for Kim McGuinness. So you've got this compositional change that's happened, particularly because we've been all-out elections, and then they're going to have to think about how they work together to get things done in a way that I guess they've not had to do before. One thing that I theorised earlier, and might be a potential future policy changes, if you want to move to a world in which people think of these elections as more about local issues, do you move to a system in which the mayors are elected at the same time as the councillors? So you have the all-out elections at the same time, for the councillors you do for the mayors, so then it's seen as more of a local thing than a referendum on national issues, which it has been seen as. And then coming out of that, there are going to be big policy implications. So bus franchising is happening in most parts of the north. That's as we take buses back into public control. Is that the mayors are really pushing that? Are the reform councils still going to be supportive of that? Like I hope so, but I've not seen what their policy is on that. And then we see where reform have been elected in Hull and East Yorkshire, there's been this debate around net zero and green jobs. Is that going to start to have an impact too? Unknown. I'm a bit more optimistic on the Devo front. I think because so far we've seen at least a cross-party consensus towards devolution. So Labour began the journey that we see now back in 2009 with the Local Democracy Act. I forgot what the full title was, but it was back in 2009 that created the combined authority model that we now see. The coalition took that forward with George Osborne and the Conservative-led government taking that forward through 14 years, and then Labour's picked that mantle back up again. I've not seen anything which suggests that any of the five major parties, as you might describe them now, are going to row back on the devolution agenda, but people might correct me if they've seen something otherwise. But so I'm optimistic that there is a cross-party consensus for this, which is good. And we know that the current government are pushing forward with this, and there's going to be a fiscal Devo roadmap in the budget. So I'm trying to be a bit optimistic about it. In summary.
Yeah, I think on the face of it, more devolution is never going to come. The prospect of a fully devolved north is still, in my view, in sight. What I worry about is really the nervousness from the centre, talking about the Labour Party in particular, who's in government, thinking, which is sort of what happened in Gordon and Denton as well, sort of say, oh well, we could get a reform mayor in Manchester, and I never actually believed that that would be the case. But there is a fear, I think, often in certainly within Number 10 and within Parliament, that there's a lack of understanding of what's actually being done, how people feel, and that disconnection actually plays out nationally, because when we do go down to Parliament, it's always like, oh, this is going to happen, da, da, da. And I say, well, I don't really think that is the mood. That's not really what's happening when you're actually there. And I hear from parliamentarians as well saying, we've been going on about we need this in my constituency, and all this money's going into Andy Burnham's, into the combined authority, and all of those things. But how is it trickling down to the people? Because the whole point of devolution is that people do feel engaged and empowered, which is the other bit of the bill, when actually, as soon as something goes wrong politically, it feels that it can be crawled back into the centre because of the caution, which largely is why, in my view, why there's been really not much coming out of it. So it's a bit of a virtuous circle when people aren't feeling it, because, again, the way we're structured or what people think they're voting for goes back to and party will only say, oh God, we don't want any more reform. So that's sort of having a minute way or lesser way, or when we got Luke Campbell and Andrea in Lincoln and Yorkshire and Hull. So I think that there is that nervousness about the political ramifications, but what actually has happened, we've just got more and more of it. The local government, and I think that whole thing, that sort of, what people were voting for, the incumbents, knowing the national, is really important. So I'm one of the movers a little bit on this conversation. I'm going to bring in Mark now. Can you hear me, Mark? That sounds like I'm going in a match of the day, doesn't it? Hello?
I can indeed.
There you are. You
Yeah,
can.
can you all hear me?
Yeah. Okay. So you just tell me very quickly what you think went wrong, and also your sort of thoughts, given your past political experience of Greater Manchester and the North, about what needs to happen next.
Where do you start, Jill? Going back, I thought it was very interesting at the top when you were talking about the macro situation of why have we got to this point in some point there has been an earthquake in our politics. I don't know if it's 2001, 9/11, is it the global financial crisis in 2008? Is it for someone like myself hailing from the peripheries of the United Kingdom, the 2014 Scottish referendum independence vote as actually being a rupture in that idea of what is the UK and what is the vision and what is the future of the country. And I think there's just been, including of course Brexit, and there's been reams and reams of debates has happened on the topic of Brexit itself. But I think all of these things have brought us to the situation today, and you've touched upon this on this idea of vision and also fragmentation. I think the fact that we are talking about 5 parties as being the way that we'll operate at least over the next 3, 4, 5 years until the next general election, I think that's why we've got to that fragmentation, because politics, I've often seen politics or the state itself as being a reflection of the people. This is a lot of times, I think, Jill, we joked about this a few weeks ago whenever we met up, whenever I used to go door to door chatting with people, and they would say, "You're all the same." I used to walk away from the door kind of thinking, "No, we are kind of, aren't we?" Politicians are all pretty much the same, or they hear the same promises from door to door. And what has happened, I feel, is that there's just been increasingly a huge deficit of trust has got at the very centre of our politics. And it's interesting, when I look at two examples which I noticed yesterday in my letterbox. I received the House magazine from the old employer, and Rishi Sunak's on the front of it. And Rishi says, there's a wee strapline beside him that says something, paraphrasing, but he said that I wish that I was more honest about the challenges that we're going to face when I was Prime Minister. And another one, perhaps we've got a more progressive audience here today, Jill, but another one was, I noticed this morning, GB News had a clip came through from Geoffrey Clifton Brown, who's he's still a Conservative MP. And Geoffrey's, you must know Geoffrey, he's an interesting chap. And Geoffrey, basically he was saying that if democracy, in our own case, British democracy, doesn't start proving itself, that democracy will wither on the vine. And I do think this sounds like histrionics, but I do deeply, deeply believe in this, Jill. It's why I'm here today, because I think Merita and James and yourself being converts and evangelists for devolution, I'm really interested to see how devolution can be maybe not the panacea of all the problems and all the ills with the UK political system, but if it could go some way to solving some of the problems we're faced with. I'll finish just on this little note here, Jill, is that, and obviously I'm mad about everything connected to China, so that a lot of my career has been spent there, working there in diplomacy, and when I was in Parliament. What was really interesting, when you think back 1970s China, just after the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, and China's economy was in tatters. I mean, the society was in tatters. And they actually, in the late 70s, early 80s, through people like Jiang Zemin and Deng Xiaoping, they actually went on all these overseas trips to Singapore, and they went to the United States. They actually, one place they got inspiration from was actually Shannon in the Republic of Ireland, because many people don't know this, but Shannon, the airport in that surrounding area, was actually the first special economic zone that was ever initiated in the 1950s, 1960s. And it just shows you that when they made this ambitious change in their political economic system, and they decided to localize, they said, this centralization that we've been having and over politicization of stuff isn't working, and they decided that it was going to be the peripheries, Guangdong and Anhui and all these different parts of the country, that they were going to get rich first. They were going to open up, and that was going to be a sort of a electric shock treatment to the whole of the country. And I would say it's paid off. These last 40 years you've seen where they've had a form of devolution, that has actually worked, but it comes with I suppose, a political price. Can Westminster wean itself off the power? Because I find it deeply ironic that you read any political scientist writing on the UK state, they'll often say that the UK and Westminster is one of the most centralised states in the world. Of 200 countries, if anything, it's even more centralised than China is, say, for example, today. But despite that centralisation, nothing works. That kind of iron grip that the UK government has across the NHS and all these elements has not worked, Jill. So it's time for a change. I'll stop on that now.
Yeah, I think that's the point, is that the whole thing, we need, people are looking for change. We wanted a revolution, and we've had more of the same. In the meantime, sort of getting that buy-in, that economic benefit, and, the feeling of prosperity is there and happening, but it doesn't translate. And, people, I think, like living in Greater Manchester. I'm sure, Myrtle, you'll love it. And, and we all do, really, and that's why we're here. But what's annoying often is that the opportunity doesn't follow, or people are coming into the area to say, yeah, I'm going to set up my business because there are, whether it's, in theory, education, clean power, whatever. There's great things happening and economic potential. And we spend a lot of time, certainly Greater Manchester and other mayors are going off worldwide and say, come and invest in the equivalent of Shannon, but come, we can do it. We've got the jobs, we've got the skills, and we just need that investment. So that's a lot of that's going on, and it's going also nationally. I've never seen so many trade envoys, for all parts of the world being appointed by this government. And yeah, that's largely, we could argue, I'm not saying it is, could argue because of Brexit, because that trading relationship we had is not as strong. So there's lots of factors around the economy, but you're absolutely right. The point of devolution at the end of the day is exactly what people are voting against with Keir Starmer, is that you've got to have a more centralised, local, responsive, giving people the decision-making power so they actually do feel consulted. And I know that Edna might, from People's Powerhouse, might say something about this later. That feeling that you are part of it is why people should vote, and that's why you get away from, you're all the same, you're all the same. You're not all the same, because you should be able to answer that. But as long as the narrative is always centralised, it will continue to be centralised, and the media is centralised. Even though we've got the BBC, we've got ITV, Channel 4 and Leeds, all of those things, they're still, and the civil service equally, over-centralised. We need to get more representation and more governance out there. I'm going to shut up because I get carried away. And
So
you want to come in, Martha?
I want to challenge you a bit on
Me?
something. Yes.
Oh.
So just on you saying, there's so much happening and so much is changing, and that's very true. And I think Manchester obviously is an amazing success story, and not just Manchester. There's so much happening, across the north. I just wrote about Rotherham, which has seen kind of the fastest growth of any sub-region in the whole of the UK. But we can't forget that 20% of people in this country are in poverty. Right? 1 in 5 people do not have enough money just to make ends meet. Right? And we have a cost of living crisis that is still biting, and the interventions that have been made, I think, are clearly not resulting in a kind of any change in voting, and people are still,
they're not feeling it.
they're not feeling it.
Yeah.
And I think if we want to make devolution work, we have to make that very central to the programme. It has to be something people can feel in their daily lives, because otherwise I think we risk, further disenchantment from politics.
And I would say, that's a very fair challenge, because I actually agree with you, because they don't feel it, and that's the problem. That's what happened last week, basically. They're not feeling it, even in places where I'm saying you can potentially see growth. And you can say, I could get, what's it called, the Mayor's Fair and Tracy Braben's, the buses, all of those things.
And I think there's a lot of innovation happening. So if you look at Andy Burnham's Good Growth Fund, about, I think it's called the Good Growth Fund, of redistributing, growing the economy, and then using that to invest in places that might be growing less fast at the same time. I think it's very interesting, like potential for different models, both of economic experimentation, but also democratic participation that you can try.
Yeah. Yeah, and as long as I've been doing this, which is actually decades, on devolution and why it's a good thing. I will say, as a communications professional, the communications of this government have been absolutely dire. They can't, as I said also in the story, they're missing the point. They're not actually they're not being heard or listened to. So, and within that, you have to have good communicators. And actually, I think there is a good story, but there's a disconnect. That disconnect between actually Parliament's sort of left behind, which is one of the things I'm trying to do with the establishment of a Northern Growth Group, which brings Parliament into the mix. So they are actually become advocates and communicators for what's actually happening in their areas, and also or advocates for what's not happening in their area and what needs to be done. So we get a situation, whether it's SEND or what's the pension reforms or whatever, then people will protest because they're not feeling it. You need, or even visitor levy, I'll do that because you're there, Andrew, where you have Parliament sort of in a situation where they are being briefed on something that would really impact on that economy, but none of those MPs are actually speaking. Very few people really stood up in even the English devolution, even though I did a joint briefing, who really, and I promise you, really understand what devolution could mean and why it's a benefit local people. So that connection between Parliament is really important. Connection between local is really important. But the missing ingredient here, I think, has to be and always is how do we communicate how that feels and why it's a good thing, and you get behind it and you get excited about it. I'm going to bring you in now, JP, because I've talked. You've got to cut me off, even though I'm in the chair.
One thing I was reflecting on when you were both speaking then is how it's really hard to communicate anything to do with devolution because of how complicated it is. So.
But that's why I think we should stop. We should just talk about growth.
Yeah, I was going to talk more about the structures. So the structures differ across the country so wildly that I think the media find it really hard to explain. I think quite rightly, because it differs so much. You've got unitary councils, you've got district councils and county councils, and you've got combined authorities in some areas, and then the combined authorities differ between different areas, and some of them certain powers and some of them don't. And I think that complexity means that it has a few different ramifications. One is for the media; it's really hard for them to explain what's going on because it is so complicated. So that's why I think they default to national narratives around local results, and then that becomes like a kind of self-reinforcing thing. Because the second point, which is people don't understand it, most importantly. So I was thinking of the example of somewhere like Halton in Liverpool City region. Halton is part of the Liverpool City region, so they have Steve Rotherham is their mayor. They're a unitary authority that is also part of Cheshire, so they're part of the Cheshire police area. No one, people don't understand it. Like when you talk about it like that, you're a bit like, how do you even explain that to somebody? You live in Liverpool City region for some things and Cheshire for other things. That's before you even get to thinking about health boundaries or other kind of administrative boundaries. So I think that it's very technical, but I think people need to know where they live before they're able to then vote on know what they're voting for. And I think the thing that the government is doing, which is good, is trying to rationalise these boundaries. Bringing in unitarisation and thinking about aligning the boundaries as they talked about in the devolution white paper. Now that's not going to be sufficient. I think it's really necessary. It's not going to be sufficient. But then you need to get to that point where people are able to vote to change things, and then the people who are elected to change things have the power to change it. And that then requires people to know what powers sit at different levels, and also a world in which you don't have central government imposing lots of burdens on local government, which then take up all of their budget. So the obvious one here is social care. People don't know that, what is it, about about 60% of the budgets of local authorities go on social care. So when they vote, yes, local councillors can make a bit of a difference, but people often say, if anyone's done any door knocking here, you'll have heard this, well, my council tax goes up 5% every year and I don't see anything for it. They're right. It's because it goes on social care, which most people don't see. So I think, and this is something we've talked about, I think, Labour, which is that you need to move away from a world in which social care is funded locally from council tax to one where it's funded nationally from national taxation, because it's a national imposition that's being put on councils. You could think about aligning it with the NHS more, moving towards a national care service, etc. And then the things that people are voting for locally are the things that local councils actually control. Bins, playgrounds, local services, libraries, leisure centres, etc. And I think that's really important to fixing democracy, local democracy and national democracy, and then getting that kind of motor of change happening as a country, and being able to communicate it, and then the media being able to communicate it too.
Yeah, I mean, that's a problem that in theory the English Devolution Act will sort of is around simplification, but the navigation at the moment, I think what people understand, they understand Parliament, they understand general elections, they understand as Prime Minister, and they understand that you go to your MP if you're cross about something, largely, and not actually is happening there is a sort of a parliamentary localism, if you like, or people very much focused on being re-elected. There is a misunderstanding about who is responsible for what, particularly hard on things like social care, integration of healthcare as well. Who's in charge of that? Where you go to? Da, da, da. What do people care about? I hear, like maybe in Gorton and Denton, a big issue is fly tipping, more than a local issue. Talk to another MP in Liverpool, he'll say what people care about here is on-street parking. You go to my area, it's potholes, potholes, potholes. Now, that's the truth, and then you get in a situation where is that local? Is that really for the MP to be doing it, or largely it'll be around housing, where they live, and other things. So there's sort of like the bigger thing around growth and money in the back of your pockets, which people want to feel. Where does that sit? How does that feed down? How does it trickle down? Because it is around the economy, but people can't navigate it, and then they get left behind, and then you get back to the cycle of you're all the same, you've done nothing for me. But even if you do, having worked in Parliament many, many moons ago, in good old days, it was just you were a glorified social worker, right, basically, and I don't think that's changed. I had all kinds of, you name it, you did see, you have that. But what we're talking about here is how do you actually connect people to politics and also get them to feel that they have a voice and how they utilise that. But I'm going to call you in, Mark, because having been an MP and having been a glorified social worker, for want of better said, now I'm sure you're far better than that. But the point being is you've got this sort of compromise of like national sovereign power in Parliament, governed by your political party and governed by whips and all of those things. And then in contrast, you have a mayor which doesn't have anything like that, has the freedom to do things without the party on what will match the area, and get on with it. So it's a very different and interesting situation that we're in, given what we're talking about. Five-way politics, how's it going to be? Where do we go from here?
You see, the run up to it, whenever I was elected in 2019, I have a very good Irish friend he was being a bit of a sage for me, and he said, Logan, he said, if you get elected here, just remember, people only care about what they can see out their living room window. So when you look out your living room window, their hedges are coming into my garden, look at those potholes, the bins aren't being collected, etc., etc. And lo and behold, I would say 70%, maybe 80% of my inbox, parliamentary inbox, this will be experienced by lots of MPs in blue wall or red wall seats, or turquoise seats, I don't know if they're called that now in the north of England, that just someone comes to their MP, a lot of the times it's because they've reached the end of other journeys, whether it's by the police or the hospital or even with their lawyers. A lot of the time, there's one story I remember towards the end of the tour when I was at I can say now he stepped down. So the German ambassador back in 2024, he's now left, he's somewhere else, but he said to me once, he said, you Brits, you're funny people. And I said, well, he said, well, I get British people who've left Germany, they're sending emails to the embassy here asking, how do they discontinue their electricity bill in Berlin, or how do they do X, Y, Z in Munich? And he said, that's not really what we're here for. He said, in the Bundestag in Germany, the equivalent, the MPs, they don't have as direct a connection with their electorate. They've got much larger numbers, a bit like, say, if you're in Japan, 200 to 300,000 people roughly in a constituency. In the United States, something similar for senators, or I think it's even higher for those in the House of Representatives, and amongst other things. So he asked me, he said, Mark, tell me the truth. What percentage of people do you actually help? And I said, don't ask me that, because you could be telling a journalist the next day, and he said, oh, go on, what percentage do you think? Like 10%? And I said, like actually helping, like causal mechanism A to B to C. I said, you'd be lucky if you were helping 5%. I said, like, you could spin it and say 50%, 70% because you signposted them. You put people off to go and speak with the Citizens Advice Bureau or to speak with X, Y, Z. But actually, tangibly helping people is incredibly difficult. And I think that's overall, Jill, it's going back to what are these different layers and levels of the state? What are they supposed to be there for? What's an MP supposed to be doing? What's a mayor supposed to be doing? What's a councillor supposed to be doing? And I actually, from that experience, I feel we've got brains here on the panel who'll know how to kind of articulate this better than what my instinct is telling me. But I do feel instinctively that we have too many MPs. I don't think we need 650 MPs. They'll not like me saying that. They would never, the turkey will not vote for Christmas. But I think if we had 400 or less, we would be fine. And at the same time, I also think when it comes to councillors, like I had some of my councillors in Bolton North East were exceptional people. They were working incredibly hard. They were putting in more hours per week on the job than a full-time job. A lot of the times they were doing all of these kind of extracurricular, running Halloween parties for their local communities and Christmas parties, whatever else. But Jill, they're only getting paid, 14, 15 grand, 16 grand if they have a position on the council, maybe a little bit more than that. But it's just not enough. It's simply not enough. I mean, you have the case where you have councillors paid, even the leader of the council, 30, 40 grand or whatever it is, going to meet with the chief executive, a civil servant who's paid 120, 130 grand. And the asymmetry in that financial payoff and the experience and the time that they're allocated to do their respective jobs, I just think is part of the dysfunction again of the state. I'm a great believer. I think a lot of times you'll find when people here are working with their MPs on different things is that they'll get involved in hyper-local issues. But I actually, deep down, I don't believe that's what they're there for. They're not. They're there to represent the constituency in Westminster to speak on national and or international issues. But we need to give more power, more money, more fiscal manoeuvre, I think, for both the mayors and local councillors.
I think there does need to be some kind of fundamental reframe, and I think we may well get there. And I'll be interested. That's why I'm sort of, I'm obviously going to always say devolution is the solution to almost everything if you get it right. But it has to come, and if we do get there, because I think that's why we've seen sort of like celebrity selfie sort of trips away to various parts of the Council of Nations and regions, which they all seem to have having a very nice time and collaborating, and then sort of, yes, of course, that's what we're going to do. We're going to have, we'll give you this and we'll give you that. All of those things. It's all very good, but people don't understand that. which part of local government is responsible and actually who they're actually voting for in their particular ward and what that means. So we are in a very interesting state, and and I think, you know, very quickly I'm just going to do two things. I want to talk about what does no over control. We've touched on it already. Politics actually mean in places like West Yorkshire or places like Rotherham. You know, how is that going to work? Are we going to get collaboration and consensus on some of the issues, or is it just going to be sort of deadlock, which again slows progress, or is it just going to become dysfunctional, fragmented, other words like that? So Myrta, what's your take on that?
Thank you. Just to pick up on your earlier point, I actually do think the government has thought a lot about this question of accountability and people. I think one of the devolution agenda is going to take time to bed in. We've had MPs for forever, right? So it's going to take time, and I think a big advantage is with mayors, you do have a face, you have a person that you can turn to, and we actually did some polling with sortition just before the election that my colleague Brian wrote about, and about political trust. It was extremely low across the board, really shocking actually in Greater Manchester, but the greatest political trust was for the mayor himself as a person. Obviously we don't know if that's an Andy effect or what it is, but I do think there are causes for optimism there when it comes to that, and obviously we have the rollout of the devolution map as well. So the fact that this is now being rolled out nationally, I think the devolution bill got royal assent maybe a week ago. So the completing of the map, as people say, is happening, and I think that will help tackle some of those questions of inconsistency and who's doing what, but you guys will know more having worked on it for longer than me. On the no overall control, I mean, I think it's fundamentally trying to fit in that five-party politics we have now into a system that isn't built for it necessarily, and I think parties and people are going to have to get a lot more used to working in coalitions, working cross-party lines, on things they might find uncomfortable or difficult, and I think our colleagues in Europe will maybe have some advice about how that can be done. But I think there is a real risk for paralysis and division, especially when there is that combined authority layer that is now different to the local layer, because that collaboration between local authorities and mayoralities is built into the way that it functions. So yeah, I'd be curious what you guys think, but it is a concern.
Yeah, and one of the best things about devolution hitherto has been their convening power, the soft power to get things done. And that's, when you think about it, obviously Labour has been traditionally Labour, in all the 10 authorities, with Stockport, and different things are going on. I think it's a very different, my very quick look at your pie charts this morning, I thought were interesting in terms of Liverpool and Greater Manchester by comparison to what's going on the other side of the Pennines. But yeah, you tell me what you think.
Yeah, sure. So on the composition of the five different areas, I think we saw the biggest change in West Yorkshire and the North East, mainly by virtue of the fact they're all out elections. So the local government boundary commission for England did its kind of once in a generation review of different councils, and then I think in West Yorkshire 4 of the 5 councils had all out elections. So it was only Leeds that had elections in thirds, and that's why you saw such a big shift. And you saw similar in the North East, and within Greater Manchester and the Liverpool City region, I think it was mostly in the whole of Greater Manchester was in thirds. I think one part of Liverpool City region had all outs, but otherwise in thirds. So that's why you saw the big shift in those places that had it, because everyone was being elected, so there was more scope for change. But I think on no overall control, there's a long history of no overall control in lots of councils. So my home council of Kirklees has been no overall control at least for a year now. It just means that parties have to work together, and that's what politicians just need to do. And we've seen being able to do it. term. So, for example, in Kirklees, they needed to pass the budget before the elections happened, and the ruling Labour group was able to work with councillors from different parties to get different measures in and pass a budget. And yeah, we just got to hope that our politicians can do that. And hopefully the ones that are new to no overall control will just learn from the ones that have been experiencing it a long time.
Yeah. And I think I'm just going to swerve straight into Mark on a sort of more wider question, which we touched on before we started, about how do we actually talk about, is it, I mean, in a nutshell, is it time to really reform our electoral processes? Is it time for us to really think about maybe not first past the post, but to sort of think even compulsory voting? I think Malcolm Turnbull, former president of Australia, was on the radio the other morning, sort of saying that was his. When you've got a lot of parties, you need to have need to have a better voting system than first past the post. Now that's, given what we've sort of talked about earlier, that people don't necessarily understand what they're voting for. But I'm sort of taking with it in this day and age where we're constantly looking at your phone, caught you. When we're getting information, or people are getting information in a flash, in a nanosecond, and half of that information may not be true, false, whatever. It might be completely misleading, but people are saying, oh look, they've got 1 million likes for this must be true, or and you've got wars being made over bloody text or X or whatever. These are worrying times. So if we're all going so fast and all that information is there's a lot of noise, and therefore you sort of lose that connectivity with democracy, I think. And I think that's what's missing. And I also think that one of the problems, which I hinted at earlier, is around how slow the government has been, because the parliamentary process is slow. It's slow for a good reason, because government, bills need to be scrutinised. That's a big part of it. But that's also slowly the feeling that, hey, we've had some really great legislation and I can see the change. What people are seeing is the negative, not the positive, or they're not feeling. It takes time for these things to actually bed through or come through, because we're promised a lot of it is jam tomorrow. Even North House Rail is like 2030, when there may well not be a Labour government then. So views very quickly, is it time for democratic renewal? I think the answer is yes, and how do you get it? Is that electoral reform? Do we think the compulsory idea, now this is a curveball really for me, but I'm just sort of slightly persuaded that in this digital age we need to have better access to democracy, or some kind of representation which is more live than every 4 or 5 years. I'm sure there's somebody who doesn't believe in what I'm saying, but what do we think? Oh, Mark.
Jill. So, yes to all the things you said, but I suppose it's a sort of a question of timing. I'm not sure, because of how fast things are changing geopolitically, the extent to which the country, the UK, the state itself, will have to react to impending crises which could be increasingly significant. So I don't know, the more democracy in the short to medium term, I'm not entirely sure. I mean, the other thing we haven't, I suppose, talked about, I don't want to be this person at a conference that says, no one's talking about AI or technology, but
that was my thing, being faster than how we,
yeah. And I wish I'd studied hard sciences at university now, but maybe there are aspects of AI which will be a kind of game changer across how state society, the interlink between the two, the efficiency, some of those problems we were talking about earlier about signposting, or where should people go for such and such information. The other thing, just a point to finish there, Joe, as well, so I know, Merit, when you were talking there about learning from someone has a piece today, yesterday, that they were talking about the kind of future of British politics being increasingly European. And I don't know, it might not be a bad thing. Like when you think, like UK, we have a national democracy once every 4 or 5 years, and then supposedly for 4 or 5 years, when we have this strong government, we're a dictatorship, and that's what we should have had whenever Starmer won the landslide back 2 years ago. But if anything, over the last 16 years, the most stable government we've had has been a coalition government, Tory and Lib Dem. So maybe throughout the different levels of government, perhaps coalition can work. But we are also sceptical, because Jill and I know, on a Greater Manchester level, I was the odd one out amongst the Tory MPs, because I was willing to work with the Greater Manchester entity. I was willing to work with Burnham, but my colleagues in the Tory party kind of ostracised me. They're like, no, don't be giving him any legitimacy, you know. And there was a real pressure. I think it was unfortunate, because the reality of his mandate, when was the last mayoral election in GM? Can you remember, Jill?
2 years ago.
2 years ago.
2 years ago, yeah. So on that election, Andy Burnham, I think it was that one or the penultimate one, but Burnham won every single ward in Greater Manchester, including my 2 wards in the very northern part of Fulton North East, called Bradshaw and Bromley Cross, and they were, and still are, considered the most conservative 2 council wards in Greater Manchester, and he was able to turn those Labour red. And that kind of shows you that, I think, the way I would read into that is that they were supportive of Burnham as a person, but also on balance, they could see the benefits of having a mayor at a Greater Manchester level. I think that adds perhaps to maybe Burnham's legitimacy in the long term if he's looking for a career change.
Yeah. Well, we'll see, won't we? That's one of my questions in a minute. Berta?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a very strong case for electoral reform. I'm not an expert on this topic. I think the supplementary vote system is very interesting, and I think we have to think about translating these results to the national level in 2029 and what that picture would look like. And winning parties increasingly winning on a smaller and smaller percentage of the vote, and how democratic that is. So,
Yeah.
yes.
I think the low turnout thing is
Although turnout did actually increase in this election, which potentially shows a bit higher engagement, or people being extremely frustrated.
Wanting to frustrate, I think that's the thing. There you go. JP?
So yeah, I think it's really good that the government are bringing back supplementary vote for mayors, and in the next set of mayoral elections, I imagine that will be implemented. I think compulsory voting is really interesting too. So we published a paper a few weeks back from somebody who has thought about this a lot, and it's all about trying to increase people's engagement with the idea of voting. So it's not just forcing people to turn up at a polling station, which is what the law is in Australia. I think you have to attend the polling station and get your ballot. It doesn't mean you have to vote. It's known as informally as like compulsory voting, but I think it really should be called like compulsory attendance at a polling station. And if you don't do it, I think you have to pay a nominal fine. But it's not just that. You could have like a bank holiday when it's the voting day, and you could have more engagement, especially particularly with young people now. They're extending the vote to 16 and 17-year-olds, and I think all of these things have to be part of it, as well as sorting out the local government structures so people know what they're voting for. There's a lot of change needed.
Yeah, and it won't happen quickly, that's for sure, because I think it's about getting that sort of dialogue and discussion going, because and therefore you do need, what we need, I think, probably is that leadership and new policy, fresh ideas coming in, which actually sort of say, yeah, like Andy Burnham will say, and others will say, I'm doing things differently, to actually say, yeah, let's actually rethink this, because we're doing a long way, and actually things are changing, and we're not keeping up. So I think there's a lot there, because traditionally we're always opposed, and we like first past post, and blah, blah, blah. But in this context of democratic renewal, really quite a critical point in our time. So we've done really, really well, and I do want on the conversation, and I think we've done really well given the topic of the day and the certain resignations and other things happening. So the irony is that our New Year session was when Andrew Gwynn resigned, and look where we are now. So, so every time we hold a soiree, somebody's going to resign. I think from here on in. It's really so. So my last question is really, and I'm quite happy for anybody to put their thoughts into this one, and we will wind up. But given what we've said, and given what's happening outside, who will be the Prime Minister after the next general election? Who wants to answer that one?
I'll pass on that one.
It's too hard. Okay.
We want your opinion.
Well, my opinion then, given you've so kindly asked. My opinion is that, obviously to be quoted large, no, I don't really have an opinion, but apart from this, is what I think could happen, is I think that probably most likely that Keir Starmer will not be the Prime Minister, whether he stays on or he goes. I think the writing is on the wall. I think, given where we are, I think, and if you translated anything from today right forward to that general election, whoever becomes the leader of the Labour Party has got a huge challenge to turn that round, and that's not going to be easy. So the word coalition has been mentioned a few times. I'm not a fan of it, Mark, but and I could take issue about whether that was the best government we ever had, but it blah blah blah. But there is a case for coalition in our, to get that consensus, to get that feeling that sometimes it's not so party political, that we're actually all on that we're all part of that and we've all got something. That does work better at local level and as you move up. But we need national leadership, and we do need the sovereign power. So I don't know who's the leader of the Labour Party, and I'm not going to tell you who my personal preference is because I would be torn, because I like all of them really. I'd be no good. But on the basis that, where do we go from here? Are there any other sort of burning thoughts here in the audience about what's happened in the last week? Or you just you're all in shock? Come on, Edna, you've got something to say. No? The man at the back as well. Just two quick questions and then we'll wind up.
I think it's illustrative of the self-indulgence of the political community, that there's a continued energy driven by uncertainty and individuality and games, so forth. And I think the general public are increasingly distancing themselves emotionally from whether this is an actual serious environment in which to engage in. And it's creating a climate where extreme politics will emerge because people will be exploited for that sense of almost despair, that actually there isn't a way in which you can really connect to see how your local needs or your local priorities are being reflected in those conversations. So I think it's what's happened this week is obviously drama politics and all the rest of it, but the wider point is that I think people are losing interest in the same behaviours and the same principles. So people are not spending time to really understand how people are feeling. They're just not spending time, and so consequently people feel ignored, and then they will go to the people who they think are listening to them. So I think we're seeing a movement very right, and a real disenfranchisement with the state and the sense of civic infrastructure, and how we should all be proud of a welfare state, and how we should be a caring society. Because we're seeing our politicians behave as individuals, there isn't enough collective behaviour, and therefore we're mirroring that in the general population also. think there's a selfishness that's occurring in the political infrastructure that really people need to give themselves a really good talking to.
Thank you for that, Edna. The man at the back, and then Andrew, and then we'll have a quick roundup from the panel.
I think you put that more eloquently than I would, but the one word I haven't heard from anyone on the panel is anger, and I don't think we're understanding. It's a bit like the listening. We're not understanding why people are angry, and they have a right to be angry. If you think about flatlining wages, access to housing, a whole pile of issues, and our political establishment's not talking about it, and then you wonder why they vote Reform or Green or anyone else. So, thank you for because mine's a bit more kind of, but just a simple thing, we talked about communication earlier, and just the response from MPs choosing to die on the hill of the right to drink during work, I found astonishing. Not picking up on people most people, if they drunk at work, they'd be fired, or at least disciplined. And MPs choosing to die on that hill, I just found astonishing. We talk about communication. Wow.
Yeah, well, we won't go there because a good point about the anger point, because I think that's the whole thing around feeling, how people feel, and I think.
But they have a right to feel angry.
Of course they do, but they've also got the right to feel sort of happy, I think, as well. And government should build that sense of community and empowerment, and we should love where we live, work, rest and play, and the positive side. Andrew?
Just to reinforce what the two people there have said, I think I've been making notes on the phone, Jim, not texting my friends.
Oh, right, okay,
when
go
you're
for it.
But I think you talked a lot about growth, the panel talked a lot about growth, and I think in principle most people support local growth. But I think on the other side of that coin, unless they're benefiting it from it personally, they don't see it. And that's the biggest challenge, and I think that's why we've seen some of the challenges that we have, because the local growth is all around things like investment, you've mentioned transport, centres, jobs, NHS, everything like that, that's fantastic. But people don't see that, and what they see is higher rents, higher costs, higher taxes, council tax increase. So there's a disconnect, and you use the word communication, and I think that's one of the biggest failures of this government, is to be able to communicate correctly and efficiently.
Yeah, well, as you know, I agree with that. So, quick round. Where to start? I'll start with you, Mark. If you're still there, we've lost. We can't see you anymore.
He's behind you.
Oh, I know.
Oh no, it's not.
Is anybody there?
I can just about hear you, Jill.
All right. Okay. And just ask you, any thoughts on that?
I think that the anger point that the gentleman was making, I thought the gentleman's got a great voice. I thought we'd gone to a video there for a second to, well, he must do radio or BBC or something, but I thought he was making a really good point, and it sort of dovetailed what the speaker was saying just before that that idea of moving to more extreme solutions, and that would be my concern right now for our democracy, because the anger can be useful if we channel it in the right way, but my worry is that if we have a more right-wing government, say, comes in at the next general election, and within 12 to 18 months, if they haven't already discovered at this point, but they will discover when they're in power, that the levers of the state aren't working, very quickly the raft of people who voted for that, I think, 12 months is actually a very long time now for giving them that kind of length of honeymoon. I mean, Labour didn't get it 2 years ago, so I think you'll see very quickly anyway, Jill, that people will become disaffected and that there isn't any easy solutions, and we have reform at every level of government now, but nothing's happening, and that would be my concern, is kind of meshed with that point about anger, is that people then increasingly seek out even more extreme political manifestations, because it is a cry for help.
Yeah.
And if things aren't working
I mean, that's what we've seen with people, as I said at the beginning, looking left and right for what they're not finding in the middle or in the centre ground. So, yeah. Good. Myrta? And I'll...
Yeah, I'll keep it short. I know we've been here a while, but I think we're, as progressives, I think, or a progressive organisation, we need to keep focus on giving answers to those big questions. So there is the Westminster kind of psychodrama going on right now, but if I really hear the point on people feeling angry, and I think it's really important to drill down into what is going wrong and why these problems are so widespread. I think at IPPR North we often come back to centralisation and how much power is held in the Treasury, and even though it won't change things overnight, you know, if we talk about things like the visitor levy or fiscal devolution, they might seem small, but it puts more money and more power in the hands of local people who hopefully know more what people actually need and how to change people's lives in that way. So I think it's important that we at least keep focus on that policy agenda of what's going to make a difference in people's lives, and how do we do that in the next 2 years before the next general election. And also that connection between politics and people, and that kind of rock bottom level of trust that we have. And I think that's a personal responsibility probably to all of us who work in politics and the people who have just been elected, of how to try and do something about that.
And finally,
yeah, thanks. I'll talk about two things quickly. So one is the anger point. I mean, you're completely right. And the one thing that worries me is that we see populists of left and right now trying to suggest the really simple solutions to a kind of rolling crisis. And I think the government, to its credit, has done a lot of good stuff on some of the things you mentioned. So thinking about wages, the government's increased the national minimum wage. It's passed the Employment Rights Act to rebalance things towards workers and, you know, increase worker power. It's passed the Planning and Infrastructure Act in order to build more houses. It's passed the Renters' Rights Act in order to give more powers to renters and abolish no-fault evictions. And there's a whole raft of other things, you know, thinking about devolution, speeding up the ability for mayors to take on public control of buses. You know, it's so popular here in Greater Manchester. We're having it over on our side of the Pennines in West Yorkshire from next year. So I think there's a lot of stuff going on, but it takes a while for these things to happen. In the meantime, the government has made some very obvious mistakes, and people are angry because things aren't happening quickly, and the government has made these big mistakes. So, you know, there's got to be a change there, not just to talk about the things that are happening positively. Stop making these big mistakes and do more of the good stuff. You know, it sounds simple, but you know that's politics. And then just on the devolution side, I think that centralisation is a big part of the problem, because Westminster has too much control and is overloaded. So devolution is a really important thing that the government's doing, and I think we should, you know, we're going to see the North now is going to be a real political battleground, given what we've seen in the local elections recently. So I think there's going to be kind of increased political focus on the North, as well as the focus on devolution and the economic focus from the Northern Grey strategy we're going to see in the autumn too. So yeah, there's a lot going to be going on.
there certainly is, and I think watch this space, because it's been a movable feast since last week, and God knows where we are going to end up this side of the summer recess, party conference, and the end of the year. It all looks pretty choppy, and again, the government alone, it is it will slow things down one way or another because of that uncertainty. You do, whoever it is, you do need somebody who is a leader, and I think that's where sort of the lack of leadership in the Conservative government proceeding, and subsequently with Keir, is really builds on the anger. But you're right, there's a couple of people I've met, former general secretaries and whatever this week, and other people I've been talking about. It's just, but the Labour government have done so much, they don't understand that they can all run down all the things that they've done. I said, yeah, but it's too slow and people aren't feeling it, and that's the point you've made, Myrta. Pardon? They're not.
No.
Yeah, no, they're not feeling it, they're not getting it, and they don't know things. So I think we've called a real sort of spectrum of opinion on the shape we are in. I think the post-election analysis has been funny, not funny, I hope so, not that funny. I'll try and crack a joke now. So I think it's been very interesting. Watch the space. God knows what's will happen. Thank you to all my wonderful, wonderful team, Councillor Clark over there, Tara, who actually was one of the victors in Stockport last week. So very good there. So not all bad news for the Devo team. And we got Sam, Nemana, and Eloise as well there. And of course, last but not least, Richard. Again, thank you so much for hosting at KPMG in your wonderful, wonderful offices. It really is very much appreciated. So there is some wine, beer, and refreshments at the back if you want to stay for a little natter. I think we might want to do, if you want to do a quick comment to camera, we might do some of that for our video and things like that. And so please do stay on if you want to and carry on. And a photo, yeah. Okay, lovely.
Thank you.
Sounded great. Camera survived as well.
The following looks so good, honestly. I was watching on the YouTube live.
Oh, perfect. Ideal.